right, I'll start with a word of prayer. Lord, thank you for the wonderful variety in this world. We've been enjoying talking about, of all things, peppers this morning, and you didn't have to give us a taste for peppers or cucumbers. You didn't have to create a world in which we could experience the joy of growing things, harvesting them. Didn't have to be such a beautiful world with all the different colors and shapes and senses that can take it all in. But you did. And we are so very grateful for that. This morning, Lord, help us, guide us as we consider just a little bit more about what you have given to us and where you are calling us. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. So this week, let me hand out a few of these. This week, we're into. Oh, okay, you're good.
Thank you.
There you go. So this week we're really considering this idea of actually stepping out of the boat, so to speak, right? So in this passage we have this moment where Peter says to Jesus out on the water. Well, you tell me, what does Peter say to Jesus out on the water?
Come.
Yeah, Jesus basically responds to Peter, but what is it that Peter says first?
Was it who are you or something like that, or
The
question?
the disciples are definitely not altogether sure who it is, right? But then Peter says to Jesus, Lord, if it is you, command me to come out to you. Command me to walk to you, basically. Command me to step out of the boat and walk to you.
He said, "It is I."
Yes.
Am, right?
Right? We get this echo of I am, right? And he tells him to come, right? Just one word there, basically, come. And the question in some of our minds is he just talking to Peter, or is he talking to everybody, right? Is he just talking to Peter? Is he talking to everybody? But what do you see as the difference between a calling, right? Vocation comes from the Latin word vocare, meaning to be called to do something, right? In a very real sense, this encounter in the lake is really much larger than just this moment, isn't it? All of these disciples have been called, right? They've been called away from what was predictable or normal in their lives to do something rather extraordinary. Yeah? And now here again, they're being called to do something pretty extraordinary. But what is the difference between a career and a calling, would you say?
Sometimes it's hard to distinguish the difference, because a lot of people get themselves prepared to do something in life, their life's work, and go and do something entirely different than that. Tell me that couldn't be a calling. You thought you're going to be doing this. I never would have believed, and all of a sudden you're doing something else.
Yeah.
And to me, was just thinking about what you're saying, that's a calling in a way. God can be calling you and you don't even know it. You end up doing something entirely different because he feels that's where you should be. And it's nice if you can think about, thank you for putting me here.
Yeah, right. Yes. I mean, we can certainly have careers that fit within a calling. I would say a calling is bigger than a career, right? You can have a career that fits into a calling, but a calling is something bigger than that. Frederick Buechner once said that that vocation is where your deepest gladness meets the world's deepest need. Your deep gladness meets the world's deep need, where where God has basically given you a story, and part of that story is things that you're good at, or things that you're passionate about, or things that you feel, right, are important. And when you can take that, right, take that and basically use that for the benefit of others in some way. Buechner would say that's your calling.
God can make you passionate about it even if you're not.
True enough.
You know, and all of a sudden you said, wow, this is really wonderful.
Agreed.
Good morning.
Good morning. We're talking about this idea of calling.
I have a coffee actually, thank you.
Oh, okay.
I got one upstairs
Oh, super.
of calling.
Yeah, of calling, right? When we were saying, you know, what's the difference between calling and career? And I think part of the conclusion that we've come to so far is that basically career is smaller than calling. A career can fit into calling, but calling is something more than that. And we were talking about Buechner's quote about vocation or calling is where your deep gladness meets the world's deep need.
Mhm.
So here's a question. I mean, Jesus calling Peter to step out of the boat, right? He's calling him to step out of the boat, but in a very real way, that's a small sort of exercise of imagination compared with everything that he's calling them to, isn't it? I mean, can we just start with one of the, I think this is fascinating. Hopefully you will too. Do you have a sense of sort of the prestige of noteworthy rabbis in this particular culture? Like how big a deal it is to be one? Like from early on, you know, all of the boys are basically educated in the synagogues, and they're basically studying and seeing who are the best students, who are really the ones that are really good at this, who are the ones that really can memorize well and can memorize all the interpretations of all the different passages really well, who are the ones that just have a gift for sort of putting it all together in their heads and making observations and even building on previous observations. Be somewhat similar to somebody that has an encyclopedic sort of knowledge of constitutional law and can basically doesn't need the book to tell you, oh yeah, there was this case back in South Dakota in 17, well, we can't go that far back, I guess, but
1873.
1873, there we go. Right. And so, you know, every year they're basically taking the very best of those students. And then if they're really good at it, they get to go a little bit further than the rest, right? And better education and further. And then you take the best of those and they'll go a little bit further. And then you take the best of those. And so it's a winnowing process that by the time you get to really be really good at it, you might be called to basically follow a particular rabbi, follow a particular teacher, and be one of his disciples. So it's basically the best, the best, the best, the best, the best are the ones that get chosen to be a disciple. it takes a certain exercise of imagination for these guys to even understand, fathom that Jesus would call them in the first place, right? None of these guys is the best of the best of the best of the best of the best. None of them. And yet here's Jesus who,
Is clearly the best of the best.
is clearly the best of the best. And I mean, has rock star status, right? Not as much early on, but I mean, definitely. And they're being called to follow him, and not just follow him, but what kind of things does he send them out to do?
Really, one for miracles.
Yeah, right? You're going to go out and you're going to teach with authority. That's interesting all by itself, right?
Mhm.
These guys are not rock stars, right? These guys are not. Just imagine that. And not only are you going to do that, also what you're going to do is you're going to heal people miraculously. You're going to cast out demons. You're going to do all this. Nobody's doing that.
But the difference is he selected them. So he knew they were going to be rock stars, so to speak, when he selected them because he handpicked them.
Yeah, he did, right? His information is bigger than their imagination, in essence, which is pretty, I mean, it's pretty spectacular. So when he's basically saying to Peter, come, and we're like, wow, I mean, that's pretty, well, let's look at the context, right? Let's look at the context. That it is a big deal, but I mean, if you look at the broader context, there's a much bigger ask that's happening from Jesus to all of the disciples.
But because Peter said, can I come to you? And he walked on the water, is that an indication of his role down the road, that he would be the one that was called out to be the leader?
Possibly. I mean, Peter's definitely the one who shows probably the greatest faith in this moment. I mean, they're all kind of worried that he's a ghost, right? And Peter's the only one that's like,
And that's Jesus.
if it is you, now it's interesting, right? He does have that clause in there. If it is you, command me to come to you. If it is you, command me to come to you. What's he saying in that moment? What does he mean by that?
The foggy.
Well, it is stormy. I think there is some question of how well they can see him, right? Yeah.
He didn't have his glasses.
Yeah, he's got what I've got, presbyopia. Now, what do you think he's saying in that moment? If it is you, command me to come to you.
I think in that moment he trusts Jesus. He trusts in Jesus, and even though he goes in and starts thinking, he at that moment he trusts.
He was
If
fine
it
until he
is
started
you.
to think of what he was doing.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think in that moment, Peter's imagination is bigger than everybody else in the boat. He's sort of in tune with, well, like, oh, I mean, but if it is Jesus, I mean, this won't even be the biggest thing he's ever done.
Yeah, but if it's not, he doesn't want to be following somebody that's not Jesus.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
So, if you're going to step out, make sure it's Jesus you're following.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Right.
So I don't find a lot of fault in it.
I'm not finding any fault in it. I think in this moment, it's more than just Peter being impetuous. I really do think that this is more than Peter just being impetuous.
But because he's impetuous, he's the one that's more likely to do that than the other guys. I mean,
Could
is
be.
that possible? That's just consistent with his personality. Hey, Jesus, if it's you, tell me to come.
Yeah. Because I know who you, I think part of what's built into that phrase is because I know who you are.
Mm-hmm.
So this is possible. Well,
We
That's-
talked about the rabbis and how they were the best of the best of the best. Did you ever see some of the rabbis that get together in Israel and talk about the Bible together? And it blows your mind at how much they know about the Bible. It's so unbelievable to me. But I just sit there with my mouth open and listen to them.
yeah, I made the mistake one time on a flight to Tel Aviv. I was sitting next to a young man about the same age as me, just in college, and I had recently shifted from being a chemistry major to being I don't know. I had so many shifts there for a little bit, but eventually I became a Bible and religion major. So as I was sitting there and we were talking, he was asking me why I was going. I said, well, you know, I'm really interested in the Bible, a pretty serious student of the Bible, and I've always wanted to go to Israel and traveling with my friends to do this. And he said, oh yeah, I'm a pretty serious student of the Bible too. And 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 I was like, oh, okay. And I thought for a second, like, let's just see what you know, because I just took a couple classes in, you know, Old Testament, and I got a couple of things under my belt. I probably even it would be like watching it'd be like watching LeBron James play basketball against a kindergartner. Like his command and the breadth of what he knew, and he's like, I'm still a student though, so there's a lot that I don't know. I was just like,
Well, like you don't know.
and it was interesting because he also had studied some of the New Testament, and he knew it way better than I did at that point. And I just thought to myself, my goodness, we're getting a lesson in humility today. Okay. But speaking of, you know, of calling, it was very clear that he had a deep gladness with this. It wasn't just an exercise in being really good at something, right? It's pretty clear. Well, let's hear a little bit from Mr. Ortberg today. Let's see. How do I do this? All right, Kelly, we're gonna make you a little seasick here. Okay.
Well, welcome to session 3. You know, in the story that we've been studying together, before Peter stepped out of the boat and walked toward Jesus, he asked Jesus to do 2 things: to confirm his identity and command him to walk. Despite his reputation for impulsive behavior, Peter knew the difference between taking a foolish risk and taking a step of faith toward Jesus. So he wanted assurance that he was about to do something he was called to do, and that Jesus was the one doing the calling. So during our session today, we'll look further into water walking, particularly how it relates to discovering and following God's call. Let's begin by considering a few questions related to faith and calling.
Okay. We kind of covered some of that.
I want to start with a theological question. Have any of you ever seen a movie called The Blues Brothers? It involves these 2 characters, kind of wannabe musician felons who are on a task. And anytime somebody asks them about their task, they always give the same account as to what they're up to. Anybody remember what they say? We're on a mission from God. They say we're on a mission from God. Part of the joke of the movie is that two characters like that would be on something as big and important as a mission from God. I mention this because Jesus taught one time, ordinary people like you and me, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. You are on a mission from God. And the reality is, either you are on a mission from God with your life, or you're not, or it's not true. So in this session, we're going to talk about how do you know what your mission from God is. Man dies and appears before Peter at the pearly gates, and St. Peter asks him, why should I let you in? Did you ever do anything really noteworthy with your life? And the guy thinks for a moment. He says, well, one time there was a girl who was being harassed by this group of bikers, these huge bikers, and on up to the biggest one. And I smacked him upside the face. I ripped his nose ring out of his nose. I kicked his bike over. I said, you leave her alone or you're answering to me. And Peter's quite impressed. He said, when did you do this? When did this happen? The guy says, about 5 minutes ago. How do you know whether or not something is really a mission that God has for you, or whether it's just foolishness? There's a new activity called base jumping. It involves people who climb up a cliff or an antenna or a bridge and then jump off and hope in the few seconds it takes them to fall hundreds of feet that their parachute opens. It is highly illegal, unbelievably dangerous. Psychologists have identified actually a gene. If you have the long version of this gene, then you are what one researcher calls a type T or thrill-seeking personality. And I mention this to say that the story of Peter getting out of the boat is not about somebody who just is a type T thrill-seeking person. Peter is what might be called the type W person. He is a water walker. He wants to walk on the water. And there's a real important way that Matthew shows this as Matthew tells this story. After Peter sees Jesus out on the water, he says to him, Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water. In other words, this isn't Peter just saying, I want a thrill. This is the heart of a disciple who says, Lord, you tell me what you want me to do, and then I'll do it. Now, there's a couple of things that are needed for somebody to be a water walker, a type W personality. One of them is that when God speaks, you have to be ruthless about saying, okay, God, I'll obey. We all tend to have a kind of spiritual comfort zone. And a real important principle from Scripture is what might be called the first step principle. That is, God will enable you to do things that you can't do, but you have to start by stepping out in faith. God tells the Israelites he's going to make a way for them to cross the Jordan River. But the priests who were at the front of the line, they had to step into the river first. And the text says that the Jordan was at flood stage when this took place, and the banks were almost perpendicular. So the leaders carrying the ark, if they went into the river, they went into the river. When they took the first step, God made a way. But they had to take the first step. Now, there's on the sand concentric circles, and this might represent your spiritual comfort zone. The inner circle is what you're comfortable doing right now. Crystal, I'm going to ask, if you would, that you step over here and get into the boat. Okay? And you're representing all of us as you do this. There's an inner circle here, and this kind of represents your comfort zone. This is where you feel safe and secure. This next circle, you feel a little less secure. This one's a bigger stretch. This is a bigger stretch. Jesus is way out here beyond the outer circle. He's calling you to come to him. Have you ever been a jumper? Mm-hmm. Well, this is your shot right here. So see if you can make it from there to here. Anytime you're ready. Well, both feet together. You can't take a step. Both feet together. Unbelievable. Stand up. Thank you. You stuck that one like Mary Lou Retton. Unbelievable. Now, here's the way that God generally grows faith. Many times people beat themselves up because they feel like they don't have enough faith. But here's the way that faith develops. Never say to yourself, I ought to have more faith. Instead, just try to get to know God better. Because the more you get to know God, since God's trustworthy, the more faith you have. There's a very famous geyser in America. It's famous for one thing, not particularly its size or its beauty, but its regularity. Anybody know what its name is? Old Faithful. And this actually is a picture of this geyser, which is famous for one thing, its faithfulness. Now, if somebody were to say to you, I just don't have enough faith in Old Faithful, I have too many doubts about it. You say, hang around Old Faithful. Just watch Old Faithful. And as you see it being faithful over time, your trust in Old Faithful will automatically grow. And what happens is when someone starts inside this boat, which is where we all start, they just take one step. They trust God in one area where he's asking them to get out of the boat. And your spiritual comfort zone expands. And then you take another step and it gets a little bigger and it gets a little bigger. And eventually you find yourself trusting for God a whole lot more than you do right now. But it's only as you get to know him. And the only way to get to know God is by getting out of the boat. Now that leads to this very important question. How do I know whether any particular course of action is really God calling me or is just foolishness or thrill seeking? And I want to talk about a few ways to get a handle on this, because this is a very important issue for people. The first thing I need to do, if I really want to know how it is that God calls me, is I need to understand both what gifts God has given me. We talked about that in the last session. And what are my limitations? I find a lot of times for people, it's much easier to think about their gifts than how they're limited. John the Baptist followers came to him one day and they were all upset because they said, Jesus, the one that you baptized, is now teaching and preaching, and everybody's following him. And they didn't like that because they were following John and they wanted to feel important. So they wanted John to be the number one attraction. And here's what John said. He said, I'm not the groom, I'm the friend of the groom. In those days, the friend of the groom was a technical term. The groom's best friend would guard the bride at the tent until the groom came, and the friend of the groom heard his voice. And then the friend would step aside, and the bridegroom would go into his bride. And John says, I'm not the groom. I don't have that gift. That's not my role. I'm the groom's friend. And now the groom has come, and he says, now my joy is complete. My joy is not the joy of the groom, it's the joy of the friend of the groom. And I will not lose my joy. You will not cause me to sacrifice my joy by envying somebody else's joy. I know what God has asked me to do and what God has not asked me to do. Another thing that's real important in discerning how has God called me is to get feedback from a community of people who know me and love me. In the Quaker tradition, this is called a clearness committee. The idea is when I'm not clear on what God's asking me to do, I get a few friends together. And most of what these friends do is ask me questions. To have a little clearness committee of your own can be a huge help in figuring out when and where is Jesus calling me to get out of the boat. Another key in discerning where is God really calling me is simply to ask this question, do I have a genuine passion for this? And Amy, you'll be passionate about something that Roger wouldn't particularly interest you. It's a wonderful quote from a writer by the name of Frederick Buechner. Buechner says, your calling is where your deep gladness meets the world's deep need. Last piece, to discerning, to getting wisdom in this business of where's Jesus asking me to get out of the boat, is just prayer. Just lots of prayer. It is to do what Peter did. Lord, command me. And I want to tell you a story about one of my favorite water walkers. This is a guy named Bob. Bob had become a Christian fairly recently, and he started meeting together with a man named Doug Coe. Doug has a ministry in Washington, D.C., mostly to folks that are involved in government or statecraft. Bob wasn't. He was involved in insurance, didn't have a lot of money, wasn't well connected, but he was really interested in following Christ. We started meeting with Doug, and one time Bob came across this statement where Jesus says, ask whatever you will in my name, and I'll give it to you. And Bob asked Doug, is that really true? And Doug said, it really is. It's not like a blank check. You have to understand it with all the other scriptures, but yes, God loves to answer prayer. So Bob said, well, I got to start praying for something. Doug said, all right, what would you like to pray for? Bob said, I think I'll pray for Africa. Doug said, well, that's kind of broad. Could you narrow it down a little bit? So Bob said, all right, and he chose one particular country. And Doug asked him, you ever been there? No. You know any people from there? No, I just want to pray for it. So Doug made a deal with Bob. Doug said, you pray for this country every day for 6 months. And if nothing unusual happens, if God doesn't clearly answer your prayers, I will pay you $500. But if God does answer, if something does happen, you pay me $500. And if you don't pray every day, the whole deal's off. Kind of an unusual approach to prayer, but Doug's kind of an unusual guy. So Bob starts praying for a long time, nothing happens. Then he's at a dinner one night in Washington, D.C. People sitting at a banquet around a table telling each other what they do for a living. A woman mentioned she helps to run the largest orphanage medical facility of its kind in that country. Well, all of a sudden, Bob just roars to life and starts pounding her with questions. She's been sitting there till then. And to catch her breath, she asks him, you've been to my country? No. Well, you know people in my country? No. Well, how come you're so interested? Well, this guy's kind of paying me $500 to pray. And she said, would you like to come visit and see what I do? And Bob said, yeah. So Bob flies over, and he's appalled by the suffering and the poverty going on. Comes back to the States, and he starts to write these huge multinational pharmaceutical companies, because he's prompted to as he prays. And he says, every year you throw in millions of dollars worth of medical supplies. Here's a place where kids are dying. You ought to send your unsold stuff to them. And some of them do. And this facility ends up getting more than $1 million worth of supplies. I think one of the most exciting things that you can do, I hope you'll do it, is take the Bob challenge. Start praying for something and pray every day for the next 6 months. And if something doesn't happen, if God clearly doesn't answer your prayers, Steve will pay you $500. Oh, he may not. He may not. But I think God will hear. I think God will answer. And I'll tell you why. Because you are on a mission from God.
That is unconventional.
Brad, who was this guru that he went to see, and we had another whole series on the neatest man in the world? Right?
Dallas Willard.
That's it.
Dallas
That's
Willard.
it.
Yep. Yeah, he learned at the feet of the master. In many ways. All right, let's see here. So what do we learn from that story about Bob? What do we learn from that story about Bob in terms of vocation, in terms of calling, discernment? What do we learn?
God answers prayer.
That God answers prayer. That's a
I
good.
mean, he answers prayer, you know, he didn't just write the name of the country in the sand or, you know, get a strange letter in the mail, but it was, you know, if we believe that nothing happens by accident,
Mhm.
then him being seated at the table with this lady is a consequence of his prayer, his constant prayer.
Mhm.
I think the key is that, you know, he was told to pray every day for 6 months. And how many of us take that kind of challenge in praying for anything? I don't.
Yeah. What part of what's interesting to me about it is that his motives aren't altogether pure, right? I mean, he you know,
It
he
didn't matter.
yes, there it
It
is.
didn't matter. Because by praying every day, after a while, it became a part of his life.
Right.
I mean, if he prayed every day for that length of time, sooner or later he's going to have something's going to happen, but he's going to say, "Wow,
Mhm.
God really is that." Because if you pray, you know that you have to realize when God is answering your prayers, and then why wouldn't you want to continue?
Mhm.
Well, and it is interesting because it doesn't sound as though he really expected he really knew what to expect from that, right? Why this country? I don't know. But but he, and then his sort of his eyes are kind of opened in that moment, right? In that moment, he didn't really know what the answer is. He just kind of has a sense that there's an answer. Did you notice that?
Mhm.
It wasn't like all of a sudden it was like the heavens opened, like, yeah, this is what you're supposed to, like, it wasn't that way. He had to discern a little bit more and discern a little bit more and discern a little bit more, and then he knew.
And he was an insurance agent, right?
Mhm.
And so he was somebody who was already into business, approaching clients and stuff like that. That's what I think sometimes. If you, um, for example, can't manage to do advanced math, the Lord's not going to call you to something along that line. The Lord has formed you, um, in your life and your life experiences so that he's probably going to call you to something consistent with that. Is that fair?
I think it's interesting. I don't think we always know what's inside of us. The way that a good sculptor
Mhm.
will talk about using whatever the medium is, if it's marble or if it's granite, or yeah, they'll talk about being able to see what's inside the stone. You guys know what I'm talking about?
Mhm.
They can look at different slabs of stone and say, yeah, that was not going to work.
Mhm.
Nope, not that one either. That's not gonna, and that, it's fascinating to me that they can see it, right?
Mhm.
And I think in a very real way, Bob didn't see it, but what? Through the process, right? And trusting some of that process,
Mhm.
all of a sudden what was in there begins to emerge.
Mhm.
And sometimes I think we're not really in tune with some of the things that we really are potentially good at,
Mhm.
or have a passion for. And so it seems like, oh no, that's nothing I'd ever be interested in. But you know,
It's like, I keep thinking when you're saying that all the time, I can't remember in the movie, if you saw the movie Apostle with Robert Duvall, he's in the tent saying, give me a sign while he's out there. Just give me a sign. I think a lot of times that's what we're looking for.
Mhm.
God, just give me a sign.
yeah,
Mhm. Mhm.
just give me, yeah, just make it real clear. Um, what's fascinating to me about that is human beings have it's it's a real phenomenon. We see what we expect to see.
Mhm.
We see what we expect to see. There's a great video that I love to use sometimes as a teaching video. It's the dancing bear video. Do you guys know this one? You've never seen the dancing bear video?
Sorry to disappoint you, teacher. Live a sheltered life.
Okay. If oh man, this is okay. Well, the gist of the video is this. It's basically to sort of demonstrate awareness.
Mm.
And that oftentimes we're not paying close enough attention. It was made actually to help drivers be more thoughtful about cyclists, because we tend not to see them enough. We tend not to. But in the video, basically it says there are two teams here, and each team has about 4 or 5 people on it. Some are dressed in black, some are dressed in white. And it says, just count how many times the team in white passes the basketball to each other, right? And the team in black is doing the same thing. And so ostensibly what you're supposed to do is just stay focused as they're all moving around and sort of shifting around. Just count how many times. And so you do. I mean, you count and you try not to get distracted by the team in black and all of that. But then something fascinating is going on that I have never met anybody that's actually seen it first time through. They're all passing the ball around, and then a man in a bear costume comes through, walks through the middle of it, and dances his way through the middle of everybody and then does this in the middle of everything, like front and center, you can't miss it. And then moonwalks out of the picture. And I have yet to meet anybody who ever sees it the first time through. They don't see the bear at all. They don't see it at all. But then when you run it back and they're like, no, no way. I would notice that. I would have seen that. It's right there. I mean, it is right there. We see what we expect to see for the most part. If you ever lost your keys in plain sight and then are convinced that your spouse put them there later, this is the phenomenon. I know that's never happened at your house, but I'm just saying it happens in some houses.
It doesn't happen at our house because my spouse never does anything like that. It's always, I lose everything, plain sight or not.
No, that's okay.
Yeah. But I know the concept.
Right. And so I think sometimes we can really say, just give me a sign, Lord. Just give me a sign. I just need a sign. But we don't see it. Everybody else might see it, but we don't see it because we don't expect to see it, or we don't want to see it, or right.
It's not what we want, you know,
Mhm,
we would rather have that other sign
Yes.
that we have in mind.
Yes.
mhm.
So how do we deal with that? How do we address that? How do we get to a place, or more to a place, where we actually can see what God is trying to show us? How do we do that?
I think sometimes God hits you right straight in the eyes with that.
I do too.
I mean, it just happened to us last week, and so you know, it's something you've been praying for a long time, all of a sudden it happened.
Mm,
And it was so amazing that,
We never stop praying about it.
you know, we never stopped praying about it. And it's, the example is, I have a great grandson who was born with some problems.
okay.
And one of them was, he's not supposed to be able to walk, and he's had surgery on his legs. And he's like a year and about 3
About
months,
a year and a half.
a year and a half now. Everybody had given up on him. We prayed every night for this, so many people. Well, last week he
Wow.
blew us away,
Mhm.
blew us away. I mean, God in action, that's all I can say.
You're so thankful.
A good example of what prayer will do. That little boy walking, and I know I was there when he was baptized, and his parents are Catholic, and the priest said, we're here today to dedicate this little boy to you, God.
Mm.
And I kept praying, God, he's your little boy.
Yeah.
You've got to do this. Well, he did.
Mhm.
He's walking.
Wow.
We saw him crying in the kitchen.
Yeah, for sure.
Video. But that's a good example where God hit you right between the eyes and said, if you didn't believe this one, buddy, I don't know what you're gonna know.
Mhm.
What will you believe?
But we never doubted. I don't think really that he would want.
No,
You know,
we
it was-
didn't.
in our
We
prayers,
we just were
we were sure.
convinced. We were convinced that he was going. When we were hearing about the doctors were saying, well, you know, he's not this, he's not that. Doctors don't know everything. God does.
Right.
And he was in God's hands, not the doctors. So, wow.
Mhm.
It's a great example. Right. That's a great example. I think one of the things that he mentioned was having our own clearness committee.
I
Mhm.
thought that was interesting.
Clearness
Yeah.
committee.
That's what your dog
Uh,
does.
Yeah. It's true. Oh, well.
It's another story.
Okay.
No, I'm not gonna
Similar
tell it.
similar story it is.
Okay. I mean, do you have a clearness committee? I mean, it sounds like you guys do.
No, we don't. It's my daughter
His
who has
daughter
a committee
does.
that she, every decision she makes, she contacts us 4 or 5
Okay,
people.
okay.
She
Can't
got
make a
the committee.
decision unless she
I always
talks to all of
ask
them.
her, when she says, what should I do? I said, did you run it through the committee first?
Well, and it can be helpful, can it? Right? To
Mhm.
have people that you trust
Mhm.
and know you well enough. And I would add one more, that know God well enough
Mhm.
That's the important part.
to really offer to really offer insight and care that is shaped by that relationship, right? It's pretty, I think it's pretty crucial sometimes, because I've heard Wartburg talk about Parker Palmer. Do folks know who I'm talking about? Parker Palmer is a fairly famous writer and Quaker, from the Quaker tradition, but had quite a bit of success in the 90s and early 2000s, and I don't know, maybe he still does, but at one point, when his star was really on the rise, he was invited to be the president of a fairly significant university. And he was really thinking about all that might be possible in doing that, right? The ways in which he could try to help shape the institution in a way that would be beneficial and really just kind of take off. And he had his own clearness committee who asked him some questions about it, and it was uncomfortable because what came out was basically, well, beyond this big vision of what could happen, beyond this big vision of that, like, why do you really want to do this? And I mean, what about this really? What about the job itself really appeals to you? Like what you would be doing really appeals to you? And they basically winnowed it down, and he kept giving lists of things that he wouldn't enjoy about it. I really don't want to be involved in the interdepartmental politics. That's just not something I really want any part of, and I really don't like doing fundraising. And I understand that that's part of being a president of the school. I understand that's part of the job, and I'm not crazy about lots of meetings. And I understand that might be also involved. And
Do they like kids?
huh?
Does he like kids?
Well, that's a good
Probably
question.
not.
And so they kept sort of pressing him, and they're like, but why do you want to do this then? I mean, why do you want to? And what it finally came, he was finally very, I think, humble and honest in a way. He said, I mean, I guess I like the idea of seeing my picture in the paper with the caption president underneath it.
At least he was honest.
And he said, without the influence of that clearness committee, I probably would have launched myself into this and not been doing any of the things that I really enjoy or maybe are even good at. They would have been better served by somebody else. And the funny thing that one of the committee members actually said to him was, Parker, I mean, isn't there an easier way to get your picture in the paper than to go through all that?
Go rob him.
And and the rest of the committee got a good laugh out of it. But I mean, it's a fair question, right? Like,
Sure.
it seems like an awful lot of work for,
That you
Yeah.
don't like.
So I think a clearness committee. I think that piece about I think that piece that he mentions about not trying to jump all the way to Jesus from the center of the circle is also, I think, kind of key.
Yeah.
Right.
The clearness committee is really hard when you're trying to come up with a new idea that the clearness committee is destroying, and deep down that's something that you just have to have done. You have to see done. That's when it becomes hard to keep with your clear. Maybe you get a new clearness committee, I guess.
Well, I mean, I think that's where we basically, it's important to have more than just the clearness committee, right? So have a regular habit of prayer, right? Spend time actually checking with the chief, right?
For $500.
Yeah. Or I really think it's important I think it's important to take a look at and say, where do I see God on the move, right? I think it's important to say and think about, how would this choice impact others, right? Because oftentimes the choices that we make have significant impact on others as well. And if I'm just thinking about how it impacts me, right, I need to spend a little bit of time thinking about how this is going to impact others. There's multiple things I think that we need to look at when we're trying to discern calling, right?
In the same vein as what you're saying, Randy, about your committee, though, sometimes I can think of, several times in my life that I knew without a shadow of a doubt the direction that I should go. And I didn't want to hear anybody's opinion, for better, for worse, because that committee who knows you best, can help you discern. But I can think of times that just, no, I know this is the path. And I don't know if that's good or not, but I jumped in.
Okay.
And then, maybe with difficulty, but yeah, that's a discernment right there. When do you discern with people, and when do you just follow what God put in your heart to be what you need to do?
I think sometimes God's not gonna let you stop. Yeah, if God has chosen you to do something like that, I think no matter how much you fight against doing it, you're gonna do it. I think you're gonna have to do it.
Yeah.
Because I think God's out there, sort of like the woodpecker out on the tree going, hey guy,
We can do this the easy way, or we can do this the hard way.
are we gonna do this or?
No, I definitely think there's some truth to that. I think there is some truth to that. Well, it's interesting. We've got these. Let me make sure we're past time. Okay, well, once again, I have managed to leave you plenty to look at this week that we have not got. There's some really good passages in here to take a look at, where we get into, again, how do we step out of the boat a little bit further? How do we move out of what's just comfortable? But some great examples in here of Peter, right? And seeing from the example of Peter on the Mount of Transfiguration, right? And that's an instance, y'all remember what Peter did then, right? That was impetuous. He doesn't know what to do. He's so blown away by, oh my gosh. That's Moses and Elijah and Jesus, and what do we do in this? I'm gonna go make some shelters. That's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna make some shelters. Like, really, Peter? That's the plan? You're directly in front of Moses, Elijah, Jesus, and you think they need a pup tent? What do we learn? We learned some things about Peter and how Peter responds to Jesus over the course of these gospel stories. So take a look at that. We'll talk a little bit more about it next week.
It's like when Moses goes to see God for the first time up on the mountain. Could you imagine what that did to him?
Yeah.
Then he's spending 40 days up there sometimes, what is comes down with his face so
Glowing,
red.
right? Yeah. I mean, yeah.
Wow.
All right, friends. We will see you next week. You're welcome.